Hey everyone, welcome to the fundamentals of live production. And in this lesson, we're gonna get you orientated to how video switchers work. So before we get started, I know not everyone is gonna have the exact same setup that I have. And actually that's kind of the point. This lesson is designed to work with any switcher that you have because we're gonna talk about the fundamental principles of how every switcher works. So it doesn't matter if you've got a Blackmagic or a Carbonite or a 4A or a Sony, any other kind of switcher, the principles of how switchers work are going to be applicable across all those different scenarios. So let's do a quick orientation to kind of the setup, and then we'll get into how a switcher actually works. So what I've tried to design is a setup that really represents kind of most basic church or corporate live event setups. So what we have is 2 cameras, 2 computer sources, and a couple still stores in the switchers. Camera 2 is my overhead. Camera 3 is a full screen Mac representation of the control software that we use. And camera 4 is a lower third that would be keyed on top in a regular production scenario like at a church, where you either are keying in names or keying in lyrics. And I can activate that key by using a downstream keyer. So now you see the name there. I'm going to take that off. Now that we've gone through our sources, what does a video switcher actually do? Well, it switches video sources. It's designed so that you can bring all sources in, and it brings them all in sync with one another. So there's frame synchronizers or other pieces on the back here that bring all of our sources in. But then we need to see all of our sources using a multi-view, which we have in front of us, and then we need to send those signals back out. So we have 2 ways of getting out of the switcher. There are 2 physical HDMI connections back here. One is driving the multi-view, the other is currently showing one of the still stores. So I showed you camera 1, camera 2, camera 3, camera 4, and then there's a couple more special settings in here. So I have a still store, which is just a blue one that we'll use in a background later, and then a branded still that we might use on top in case something happens, or I just want to be able to say, hey, welcome to the fundamentals of live production. So those are our sources there. And then your switcher might have more resources than one single mix effect bus. So a mix effects bus is a mixing engine on the switcher. So I have a program bus, red, that means it's on the air, and green means that it's in preview. And bigger switchers for more complex things where you're setting up multiple boxes or you need to route a whole bunch of different signals to different places might have multiple mix effects bus engines. So you might have a 3ME switcher, or you might have a 2ME switcher. This is just a single ME switcher, but it doesn't mean that we can't do boxes and other things like that. On Blackmagic, one of the ways I get around that is something called a super source. So a super source allows you to route multiple sources to a single button, and you can see that here. So now we've got camera 1 and the Mac side by side over a background. And there's no complex keying or anything like that going on. I just choose the source I want, I set that up beforehand, and then I can just go to it. The other way that you can create multiple boxes is by going to another mix effects bus. But we don't have that. It's just something you need to be aware of. All right, so those are our sources. And let's talk about how to actually switch video sources now. So let's go back to our overhead again. And you can see that the reason I have both the hardware panel and the physical panel here, plus the Mac, is we want to show representations of how each setup works. So these are all reflections of the same thing. Every video switcher, no matter what switcher you work with, is going to have a physical frame. A frame that allows sources in and a frame that has your outputs on the end. And then you're going to have some sort of control surface. The ATEM Mini has buttons built right in on top, but it doesn't mean I necessarily have to use those buttons or I have to use those buttons exclusively. That's why I have this panel here. A hardware panel allows you to get at more sources and more functions more quickly. And finally, you have the software. So if I go to the Mac here, this is where I can adjust all sorts of detailed parameters like naming of sources. I can change how keyers work. I can change how media is brought in. So those still stores that we had earlier, I might want to switch that out. I might want to say, hey, let's put a picture of me in there. And as long as it's in my library, I have a source of a still that's me. And then here's media 2 without having to generate that from anywhere else. So anyways, let's go back to camera 1. I'm going to bring that blue background back in for a moment here. So how do we actually do switching? We have this mix effects bus. Simply to choose a source and have it go to air, we're changing just the background layer alone. So I'm going to choose camera 1 or camera 2, camera 3, or camera 4. Input 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, how is that going to work? Just press the button. If it turns red, it's on the air. But a lot of times we don't want to do that. Instead, we want to see the source before it goes live. That's why there's a preview bus. The preview bus will route any source that we want to see to a preview window on the multi-viewer. And then once we've decided, yes, that's what we want to see, it's framed up exactly the way we want, you can either press cut or auto. Cut will take the shot instantly. So I press that and we go back and forth, back and forth. When I press cut, it also flops what's in preview and program. So if I press cut, what's 2 will go down to program, preview will go up to program here, so those just swap just like that. Now, the other thing we need to be aware of is auto. So auto is a transition, and it's going to choose whatever kind of transition we define. So there's a mix, there is a dip, there is a wipe, and there's a DVE. And all of these are just different ways that we can do a transition. So if I go back to mix here, and I'll go back to camera 1 and put camera 2 in preview. If I press auto, it's going to do a mix transition. So I press that and it dissolves and it comes back. Now, if I did a wipe instead, a wipe gets defined by whatever wipe pattern I've selected. So currently it's going to come across like this, and I press auto and it's going to execute the transition there. I press it again, it's going to bring me back with another wipe. A dip is going to do the same thing, except it's going to go through a video source, a color. So when I press dip, this started flashing up here. It's telling me that my dip source is set to black. So when I press dip here, I'm going to press auto and choose a dip transition. The picture is going to turn black, and then it's going to dissolve back out to another one. So press that, see how it goes dark, and now it comes back up. So I can do the same thing with the T-bar. So whatever transition I have selected, I'll press wipe again for a moment. I can press the bar and I can control the timing of that switch from one to the other. It doesn't matter the position of the handle. Program is always on top, preview is always on the bottom in a normal program preview switcher. There is a flip-flop method, an older style of switcher, where whatever side the handle was on is the side that was live, but it would get really confusing really quickly. And so the de facto standard is to make sure that you have program preview or program preset and not a flip-flop method. So wherever the handle is in program preview, you just push it and you make the dissolve happen. So mix is almost always the dissolve that you're gonna want, or the transition you're gonna want. You can just push that fader bar to get your own duration instead of changing the duration in the software all the time. So if I want that to be a really long dissolve, I can just turn up the rate here. If I don't want to grab the handle and a 2-second dissolve, it's going to feel really long. There it is, it's complete. But I generally go for like a 10-frame dissolve or something like that. So when I press that, it just goes right away. But if I want to have a short dissolve, I can just throw the handle slowly, and I want a long dissolve, I can make it go long. So that's how that works. Let's go back to dip for a second, because I didn't fully finish what I was talking about there. So dip is going to go through one source to another. So it goes to black and then it comes back up on my sources in preview. So I'll go back here. Let's actually go to camera 2 so you can see what I'm doing here. So I have my source blinking, and this is really going to get us into what this third row is talking about. So the third row on the switcher is called the delegation bus. And basically it's where we can route signals. It's how we can route signals out. It's how we can assign it to keys or boxes. And it's, in this case, on the dip, it's how we assign what source it's going to dip to. So I'll press dip here. It starts flashing because it's choosing a source that isn't on my regular bus here. So I've got camera 1, camera 2, the Mac, and Pro Presenter, but it's not choosing that. So when it blinks, I'm going to say shift, and it's saying, hey, you're using black as your dip source. I'm going to change my dip source to color bars just for kind of crazy here. And if I pull the handlebar, you see it goes to bars halfway through the transition and then comes out. So normally, I'm gonna route that back to black, and you can see why. If you wanted to dip from one color to the other, that's how that's gonna do it. But you can just as easily dip to an assignable color in the switcher. So I've got another color here, a teal, and it just goes through that. If you had a branded color or maybe a sermon series that had that sort of thing, so here's color 2, that's orange. You can see I'm dipping through that, that's no problem. But most oftentimes what you're gonna do is you're gonna dip through maybe a media player. So if I wanted to really show off, hey, this is the fundamentals of live production, I could dip through that and I could show, hey, there's me, and now we're coming back. Something like that. But this little bus is how you get that to happen. So let's talk about, we've talked about kind of this section of buttons, the program and the preview. We've talked about the transitions here. Now let's talk about what we're actually transitioning. So we're gonna move up on the switcher to the next transition. The next transition area is how we can make multiple layers of video happen at the same time. So you'll see this on the news. You might see a box over someone's shoulder. You might see two boxes come in where you've got a host and a guest and a background. And that's how this is done over here, is by transitioning multiple layers simultaneously. So not just changing a background like we've been doing so far, but changing key layers as well. So what is a key layer? A key layer is a layer of video that lives on top of another video. And that can be defined in a number of ways. The most common way that we'd think about it, that I think about it as a video editor, is I have two layers of video. One might be scaled down, that's a DVE keyer, that's a scaling effect or rotation or position, any of those things. But you can also think of a keyer as what you might think of for green screen or a Luma keyer, where you look at the brightness of the image. So currently, I have ProPresenter here, and let me go back to camera 1. So my ProPresenter source, camera 4, is currently Luma keying. And what that means is that if I turn this on, it's taking the black and throwing away the black, and it's keeping anything that isn't black. So I have a very, very dark gray box and a colored box. And because I've defined that in the switcher as a luminance key, it's gonna throw away black and it's gonna keep everything else. So that's how I get this nice transparency around the box, even though my source is on black. So I'm gonna get rid of that here and show how we can, so that's one kind of keyer. We just put a layer on top of another layer here using the downstream keyer. But let's talk about our upstream keyers. So this is how you'd normally have boxes and that sort of thing. So I'm gonna press key 1, and you can see something kind of crazy happens. So this is where people kind of freak out going, I don't understand keyers, it makes everything weird. We're gonna get through this together. So hang on, it's gonna be all right. So key 1, and this aux delegation bus lights up again. So key 1 currently has camera 1 assigned, and you can see that in the preview. I've got a little box of me. Now if I change it to camera 2, that box changes, or the Mac, or anything else. I can put anything I want in the box. I'm gonna set it to camera 1. And we can see that that keyer, when we press key 1, is set to a DVE key. That's what I want. That's going to be a scaling of the image and making a box for me. We don't want to throw any color or brightness away. We just want to take that source and bring it down in size so we can see it over a background. I'm gonna do the same thing for key 2. Previewing key 2, I have camera 2 in there, and same thing. I can just route whatever source I want into there using the delegation bus. So here's kind of where the magic happens. If I change the background layer, you can see I've got ProPresenter in preview, and it's gonna behave simply as normal. Let's go back to mix, and you can see I'm just dissolving from source to source. But what if I want to dissolve or change more sources than one at a time? That's where I can press, so we've already pressed key 1, we've pressed key 2, or background, but what if we press all of them at the same time? What happens then is we're getting a preview in our preview window of what will happen. So key 1, we assigned camera 1, key 2, we assigned key 2, and our background preview is currently set to camera 2, which is why you see the overhead camera in the background there. So I'm gonna make that something a little more appropriate. I'm gonna put a media player, that media player I showed you earlier, the blue background in there. And now when I press mix or auto or cut, it'll do a dissolve in between what I've built in preview. So there might be an opportunity where I want to say, hey, here's how the switcher works. I want to look at you on camera 1 and I want you to see what's going on camera 2. Now that I'm going to transition my background key and key 2, I pull the handle and now you see the 2 box happen. Just like a super source, that source I showed you earlier that was kind of pre-built. Now we've manually built it here in the switcher. So if I want to go back to my regular source, if I want to go, let's say, to the Mac from here, one of the sources I'm not currently using, you can see that key 1 and key 2 are on air and the background is changing as well. So again, when I press my transition, those 3 sources are all going to go and be changed at the same time. They're all red over here, and if I press the handle, now they're all not red, they're all off air. And if I want to just have the switcher operate as normal again, I'm just going to press background and say the only thing I want to change is the background, and now I can go to camera 2, camera 1, take. So here's where things can get confusing, is I've set up my preview on camera 4, my key 4 is set up as a keyer, so I can just bring in the lyrics, or just bring in the lower third, the output off of ProPresenter. Now, a lot of times if people are running a switcher and they are getting freaked out of going, something's not working, it's because they've activated a key layer and not changing a background layer. So if I just want to bring on that key layer, I can do that. I can say, oh, okay, let's bring in the name on key 4, and that's in long enough. That's great, take it out, and now switch back to background. And now I can just change back from sources again and have a really clean setup. So being aware and having the ability to change what's in your next transition is super, super helpful. So those are upstream keyers. Let's look at the downstream keyer finally. So at the end of the switcher, there's a couple more buttons over here. So what is a downstream keyer? Well, let's look at our outputs here. So our output currently on output 1 is set to a still store. And let me change it to program here just for a moment. So now what I'm doing on program is matching there. So on ProPresenter, if I key that keyer in on my upstream keyer of key 4, you can see that the lyric is burned into my signal, and you can see that on the output of output 1. So a dirty signal is what we're seeing right now. Program, using an upstream keyer, will allow me to put that lower third in using the brightness. I'm throwing away black, and it's on top. But as I cut from camera to camera, that lower third is burned into my signal. So say we want to record the camera cut, but with no lower third on it. How can we do that? Well, we can do a downstream keyer, a keyer that is downstream of program, and we can intercept the signal beforehand and record just that clean output. So let me show you what that is. I'm going to turn that off, go back to camera 1 here. So now using the downstream keyer, we can output without recording our lyrics. Here's how we do it. So I'm going to change the output of 1 to clean, and now you see I can have a keyer come on and off, and that output 1 is going to stay clean. It's whatever I'm doing on cameras, doesn't matter. It's just recording what's going on in the background layer, and it's not recording what's going on the key layer. So program gets the keyed content, and the output 1 is set to clean. It does not get that keyed content. So it's a really nice way to manage your signals. If you want to be able to record a clean signal, clean has to be done on a downstream keyer, or your clean signal needs to be configured if you're in a different switcher. But generally, downstream keyers are for being able to preserve a clean recording, and upstream keyers are for being able to burn it into your signal and making sure that you have it in all your downstream recordings. So that's upstream, downstream keyers, and clean signals. Last thing I briefly want to talk about here is macros. So a lot of modern switchers have macros built in, and you've seen me pressing a lot of buttons here today. So what a macro does instead is anytime you need to access anything on a switcher, you can record a special button just for that. So macros help you do complex things that otherwise would be a real difficulty or slow down the production. So let me show you a couple examples of a macro. So we had individually kind of built our signal here and done a bunch of stuff to make sure that we were able to create that 2-box. Well, let's say I want to do that and not go through all those settings. A macro, I'm not going to show you how to record a macro, but just demonstrating how macro works. If I press this 2-box 16:9, 1, 2, that I've just designated that to say I'm going to have a 2-box, both of them are 16:9, source 1 and source 2 are going into the boxes. I press that and everything gets configured for me. 1 is routed to the box, 2 is routed to the box, they're scaled to the right size, the right background is selected, and my next transition area has already been activated. So all I need to do is press that one button and everything is ready to go for the 2 boxes. So that's pretty cool. Now, another macro I might have, this one is 2-box, 1 big, can do things like that. So it can just recall a different state. Same thing, it's routed my boxes, it's given me opportunities to set things up that would take a long time, and then I can just press a single button and reliably know I'm going to get that behavior on the switcher. But not every macro needs to be complex. Right next to this, I have I know that when I recall this macro, it's going to put camera 1, camera 2 in either box. But I might want to put the Mac in there. So I've created a button that just does that. Box 2 Mac just switches the source in that box. And then if I go back to my other macro, it routes me back. So let's go back to camera 1, and we're going to turn off all of these different things. So I'm changing my background, key 1, key 2, dissolving to camera 1 in the preview. It's going to go up to program. And there we are. So that's a real quick overview of how a switcher works. We've walked through mix effects buses. We've talked through preview and program. We've talked through aux delegation. We've briefly talked about keying methods, using the next transition area, upstream and downstream keyers. And finally, we addressed macros. All right, I know I threw a lot at you in this lesson, but the important thing is now we have a basic understanding of what each section of a switcher does and how it operates. Now it's up to you to spend some time on the switcher and get some practice pushing buttons. I'll see you in the next lesson.